Welcome everybody. I think people are still joining this webinar. I can see a good number of people joining in. Welcome to this webinar. This is a bit of an experiment in lots of ways. This is a webinar jointly organised by the University of Hertfordshire's Smart Mobility Unit and Bauer Media's Smart Transport Programme. My name's Stephen Joseph. I'm the link between those two. I chair the Smart Transport Programme, and I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Hertfordshire's Smart Mobility Unit. I'll say a bit about both of those in turn. I hope people will be able to see the programme about this. The University of Hertfordshire's Smart Mobility Unit, the University of Hertfordshire has a long-term involvement in transport issues, not least because it actually runs its own bus company, but it's now brought this work together in a more formal way through its Smart Mobility Unit, which is a multidisciplinary unit bringing together engineering, behaviour psychology, business, data and other disciplines to research transport outside cities. That's an important area, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Smart Transport is a programme set up by Bauer Media, which has a long-term presence in the transport world through its rail, fleet news and other titles. Smart Transport is set up to bridge the gap between the public and private sectors to look ahead at future transport trends and to try and reach consensus and reach solutions by bringing together forward-thinking people from within the public and private sectors. It does this through board meetings and a journal, but increasingly through a website, through conferences, and through networks, and through a weekly newsletter, which you can sign up to, which is free and people can sign up to it. In fact, this is one of a series of webinars that Smart Transport are running, partly because with content that was going to be part of its conference on the 17th of March, which of course didn't happen because lockdown happened before that or around that time. The idea, there's 2 points I'd make. Firstly, in general, there hasn't, most transport research has concentrated on cities. What should happen in cities? What should happen about transport, about pollution, decarbonisation, driverless cars, and all of that? That's all based around cities. However, and that's understandable given that cities are economic powerhouses. However, that there hasn't been the same attention focused on what happens outside cities, where lots of people live, and that has led to a bit of a gap for local authorities and others who want to do something about transport outside cities. Many authorities, Hertfordshire County Council, for example, being one, have declared a climate emergency. There isn't really a research and policy agenda to help them and the many others pursue that and work out what can best be done. So the University of Hertfordshire has been doing a set of roundtables to explore opportunities and ideas for tackling transport problems outside cities in the market towns, villages and rural areas that encompass rural UK, Great Britain, particularly England. As part of that, it seemed relevant to look at what's been happening to transport during the COVID-19 lockdown. And we thought it would be interesting, both from the Smart Transport and the University of Hertfordshire point of view, Smart Mobility Unit point of view, to take a look at some particular responses to on transport outside the cities. So what you'll hear today are some specific projects that have are actually taken, if you like, the opportunity of the big changes that have happened to try new things, which might have implications for what happens after this period, after the lockdown is released. What you'll hear are 2 experimental responses in different rural areas in the UK, reflections from a technology company on the role microtransit allied with data can play in meeting lockdown travel needs, and also an overview from Richard Dilks at Como UK about his take on what's happening at the moment and what might need to happen in the future. It's worth saying we're faced at the moment with a very wide range of predictions about what is happening to travel now and what will happen afterwards. I've heard very widespread stories on this. There's a view that nobody's going to be prepared to use public transport. People will be more working from home. People are going to get back in their cars and drive because they'll feel more socially isolated there. But also, on the other hand, I think there was a story today on the BBC website reporting comments from the head of the AA as a survey that they've done, which says that car users are going to drive 20% less when we get after the other side of this lockdown. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with all of those. In the meantime, though, it seemed to us that it would be interesting to hear from people who are doing things now. What will happen is you'll hear and see presentations on your screen, and then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. Please do submit questions, and then at the end of the presentations, I'll pick some and put them to the presenters to see what their view is. I hope we can get through as many as possible. I can see we've got something over 200 people on the webinar, which is a good number. And so what I'd like to do now is to introduce Beate Kubitz, who's a freelance researcher on smart transport in general, microtransit, and new transport trends. But in this case, is acting. I described her earlier as a social entrepreneur, and she points out she hasn't made any money from this yet. But I describe that, still describe her as an entrepreneur, because what she's done has been to set up an e-cargo bike delivery scheme in the small village in West Yorkshire, in the Pennines, where she lives. And I thought this is an interesting example of something in what might be regarded as quite a difficult area to do e-cargo bike deliveries. And so I'd like to ask Beate to describe what she's done. Thanks, Beate.
Thank you, Stephen. So basically, I live in the Pennines in Calderdale, which lies between Manchester and Leeds. It's a quite a hilly area with lots of slight issue that I can't seem to move my. There we go. Map of the area. You can see where we are. I live in Todmorden, in a valley which extends in 3 different directions and is really quite hilly. And at the beginning of lockdown, or even before lockdown, I actually had a cold, and I suddenly realised that I couldn't go out and I would be inside for 2 weeks, and realised 5 of my neighbours were already in this situation, and that delivery would become enormously important in our lives. As a transport planner or a transport consultant, I really didn't think that like I'd like to see a lot more vans and diesel vehicles on the roads. And so I had a quick word with Manchester Bike Hire about whether I could maybe set up an e-cargo bike delivery service and borrow or hire a bike from them. But there are a couple more thoughts in my mind that, as you see on the right, the air quality, I monitor the air quality, I ride up and down the valley, and the air quality, considering we live in a rural area, is really not that great. It's quite poor air quality. There'll be a huge future economic impact from these few months that we're sort of stepping back from the economy, and I'm worried that a lot of people in my valley are dependent on having one or possibly more cars, and in the future, when those cars become quite expensive, will they be able to find alternatives to enable them to carry out their lives? So there was a long-term thought behind it, there was a short-term thought behind it, and there was also this unprecedented opportunity for change. So what is Cargodale? Cargodale is a single, at the moment, hired Rees & Miller Paxton 80. You can see it here. It was hired from Manchester Bike Hire. I was really very lucky. I posted something on LinkedIn and I had some real assistance from Cubits, from Esoterics and from DriverNet to help me route the bike and manage the deliveries. I have lots of cycling volunteers in the neighbourhood, a lot of people who find that lockdown is not the way that they want to spend their lives. They're outdoors people, so people who wanted to ride a bike. It's a tracked bike, so I know exactly where it is at any given moment, how many miles it's done, and where it's heading. And then we also have local businesses and networks. Todmorden Market is not the world's most online business, but they rallied to the cause of people not being able to get deliveries from supermarkets, and they decided that they would go onto a website called Shop Happy and provide a click and collect and delivery service from what is a really quite analogue business. Todd Almighty Whole Foods also similarly quite analogue, but suddenly rising to the challenge of getting online and enabling people to get their groceries one way or another. And then the local cyclists who are all quite keen to rally to the cause. So we had quite a few challenges with this, as you can probably imagine. You can see the topography of Todmorden. It's very rural. It's got lots of hills. Most of the housing is along these valley routes. And it's quite dense around the centre, but there are also hilltop trips and all sorts of interesting places. Finding that people were rapidly switching to digital was really difficult. The market are still sending me names and, well, just addresses so that I can plan the routes on a photograph of a piece of paper with the order numbers and the addresses written on it. Shops are really struggling to getting all sorts of orders from different media, which is quite hard for them. And then finding also, I'm sure delivery drivers would laugh when I say this, that Google Maps is quite a blunt tool. We find that sometimes finding an address, particularly with a house name or kind of idiosyncratic street layout, takes a bit longer than actually getting there. However, in the first month of Cargodale's existence, we managed to make 211 deliveries. We cycled 335 miles and we avoided 50 kilos of carbon dioxide emissions. And that's just directly from the trips that we were making. If all of those people had travelled to the shops that we were visiting, were delivering from by car, then the emissions impact would have been much greater than that. So what have we learnt so far? I think one of the things that I really thought at the outset was that there would never be an opportunity to try a cargo bike delivery service in such a rural area. It's something that people think of as being in cities, and what we found is it's actually possible. The technology will make it up the hills. The bike assist is strong enough to do that. We also learnt all sorts of things like capacity. You can see in our Bertha, our cargo bike, she can get 6 euro crates in. So if you've got a lot of deliveries, what you need to be doing is arranging your day to create lots of small loads and smart dynamic loops. There's a lot of potential for micro consolidation in a place like ours, where there's a health food shop, there's a swanky cheese shop, there's a market which is much more basic. There's also really when I've just done whatever I could for whoever needed it. But a working business model in the future will need to be created. It'll need to incorporate maybe credits for bike hire and volunteer driving, maybe subscriptions services, maybe marketing services. If you want to make this work as a financially successful venture rather than just a helpful venture, I think it needs to be quite smart. The thing that I have found though, out and about on my rounds, is that there's a lot of interest in the bike. A lot of people saying this is fantastic. A lot of people saying we really want to retain the good air quality. We want to retain the peace and quiet of the neighbourhood. So that I hope will mean that we find some way of continuing this into the future. So that's a very basic outline of what we've been doing in Todmorden. Please do send me email questions if you don't get a chance to ask them online here, and we'll be keeping the website up to date if you want to see how we're going. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Beate. Hopefully that will raise some interesting questions. Smart Transport's been doing a lot of work on freight, in which first last mile has been a big feature, but actually that's been a city-based thing. There hasn't really been a discussion about what's been going on outside cities. So that's a very interesting lead. I'd now like to ask Jerome Mayo to speak. Jerome is lead data analyst at a new startup based in Vancouver called Spare Labs. I'll get him to explain what Spare Labs is, but he's going to be talking about microtransit and data in a time of COVID and what his grouping's been doing about it. Thank you. Over to Jerome.
Hi, very many thanks, Stephen. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, so my name's Jerome Mayo. I'm the lead data scientist at Spare Labs, an on-demand transit technology company based in Vancouver in Canada. And I actually grew up in the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent, not very far from the University of Hertfordshire, so it's a privilege to join the other panelists for this. So I'm, in these brief 10 minutes, going to try and persuade you that microtransit can lead to the following three things for transit in rural areas. Firstly, a faster recovery once lockdown is lifted. Secondly, a better oversight of how people travel. And thirdly, transit that's more resilient to shocks in the future. And these are relevant to both urban and rural settings. And as Stephen mentioned, there's been a lot of research done in cities. That's where the majority of people are located, and the economies of scale are quite significant there. But we can't forget that people do live in rural areas, and often the people who need these services are based in those locations and are vulnerable for very different reasons. So it's clear that ridership has tumbled since the start of COVID. Many of us have anecdotally experienced this and know that our transport systems have shut down. But even when the restrictions are eventually lifted, it's becoming clear that ridership will take quite a long time to recover. So 20% of people in a recent survey by Sistra, for example, said they'd make fewer trips on public transport than before, which is concerning for transit agencies. So the question for companies like ours is, how can we help turn the tide of declining transit ridership, and both now, during the crisis, and after COVID? So this is where Spare Labs has stepped in. We're a software company that specializes in on-demand transport, specifically microtransit. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, on-demand transit is essentially the perfect blend between a bus and a taxi. So it maintains the flexibility of a taxi. You get picked up where you want and you get dropped off where you want to go. But by sharing rides with as many people as possible along the way, a bit like a bus, it comes close to the efficiency and sustainability of a fixed bus route line. So we do this for three main cases: on-demand microtransit for commutes and recreational trips, paratransit for people with special mobility needs, and non-emergency medical transportation. But that use case keeps growing and growing as we develop. And so in normal times, microtransit was rapidly adopted by many agencies across the world. because it fills gaps in transit where it's economically not really that feasible to run fixed line buses. It uses advanced algorithms to simplify the planning and trip matching stages for operators. And usually you use it on an app, which makes it a key part of any modern multimodal transportation system in cities. And so I think we'll hear later from an example where on-demand microtransit's been applied in the UK. But all these things become even more important during a pandemic, really, because as ridership tumbles, agencies are realizing that they need more than just fixed bus routes as part of their toolkit, which includes, but isn't limited to microtransit. I'm going to be talking specifically about microtransit, but there are other options, of course. So I'll take you through three main reasons why we think microtransit should be deployed to tackle COVID, specifically in rural areas. And this thinking was in part developed in partnership with leading epidemiologists from the UK, actually. So I'll also present a couple of case studies to show how we've used it to tackle COVID in rural and suburban areas. And then I'll finish off by giving you a sneaky glimpse of a free tool we're about to launch, which will essentially help all agencies, big or small, to figure out the steps they need to take to recover as quickly as possible from the crisis. So firstly, microtransit helps agencies to segment their riders because of its app-based technology. So whether by risk profile, they can be determined, you can determine their age roughly, their occupation, depending on the settings you set. And this essentially can be used to help reduce social mixing, which exacerbates the spread of the virus. So Spare's platform allows agencies to prioritize certain trips over others, for example, which means that critical personnel like healthcare workers or vulnerable people, such as seniors, can be preferentially moved over non-essential travellers. And so we've had a lot of interest for this from many of our partners, especially those who have significant senior populations living in more rural areas, for example. Microtransit can also help to decentralise the risk of systems collapsing, whether that be transit or health, if too many drivers become ill, which has been a problem in many cities and in rural areas as well on traditional transit networks. So with microtransit, you have more vehicles with a bigger pool of drivers because you don't have to have specialized drivers, which means if a few drivers become ill, there is backup. The system kind of takes care of itself and it's resilient. This is way more difficult to achieve with fewer trained drivers operating buses on timetables that aren't as flexible to cover each other if one goes down. And finally, we can also use the in-app technology that we've developed to implement contact tracing, which helps us essentially to better understand the spread of the virus and to, if paired properly with the health system, can permit interventions when infections are detected. So we're not proposing this as a solution in all cases. We're very aware that, of course, privacy and security issues to consider, and there has to be a debate around that. So this is on a case-by-case basis, of course, but it's clear that microtransit provides agencies with essentially much more data about mobility and therefore greater oversight about who's sharing vehicles with whom and how contact might be transferring between riders and with drivers as well. So those 3 points essentially show how microtransit can be harnessed to slow the impact of COVID. What Spare's managed to do really well is to make it an actual tool for emergency response now, because we've shortened our lead to about 48 hours. So cities can go from having an initial conversation about microtransit with one of our growth team to the launch of a service in under 2 days. And in the last few weeks, we've launched 6 pandemic-ready transit services in urban and rural areas around the world. A great example of that is the town of Lincoln in Nebraska. Lincoln was already planning to launch a new paratransit service with Spare later this year, but after shutting down many of their fixed line bus routes in response to COVID, they decided to use the vehicles they were already deploying anyway for paratransit and shared this fleet with microtransit riders, such as essential health workers, as shown in the diagram here. So this ability to share vehicles across different transit services is actually very relevant to agencies serving rural areas where there might not be as much vehicle capacity, for example, to launch an entirely new service. So this ability and this feature that Spare Labs has developed is incredibly valuable for rural areas. But as we've had more and more conversation with transit agencies, both big and small, about implementing microtransit, we've realized that they're looking for something else. It's not just a stopgap solution. They need a guiding hand in analyzing the reams of data that they could possibly be collecting, and crucially, designing a roadmap out of the crisis. So the questions from our clients are not only which interventions they should adopt to stem the ridership decline, but also where they should make them in their city or their village or their towns, and when. Which is why we've developed a new free tool that we'll be publishing at the front and center of our website very soon. So you can see on the slide a matrix that shows ridership decline along the horizontal axis at the top, and then the type of bus line along the vertical axis. So the colors represent the different interventions we'd recommend. So gray, for example, is maintaining the frequency. Don't do anything with your bus line. Green is reducing frequency. Purple is complement a fixed line with microtransit, and blue is replace your line entirely with microtransit. So if you look on the far left at 0% ridership loss, for example, transit agencies are running business as usual because there's no pandemic. But as ridership has been declining and continues to decline, in the example we've got here, it's about 55%. The highest frequency buses in green should probably be reduced in frequency, whereas the lowest frequency buses in blue should be entirely replaced with microtransit. So as ridership begins to recover, the slider moves back up towards the left of the matrix and the interventions change progressively. And we're essentially giving agencies this free planning tool that uses the data from agencies themselves, some of which they might not be aware or actively monitor themselves, and demonstrates to them how to achieve the fastest route back up to recovery. And so there are lots of financial models associated with this that we spell out for them, but it also is a spatial tool that highlights exactly where we'd recommend each intervention in a town or city. So here's an example from Lubbock, a city in Texas with lots of urban sprawl and rural pockets with very poor transit coverage. So the blue and purple lines are the ones that we recommend should be complemented or entirely replaced with microtransit. And this gives planners a really good spatial insight as to where they should be intervening. And finally, the tool then draws in a mixture of transit data and census data to automatically figure out where the best locations for microtransit are. So this analysis, in this case, has pinpointed neighborhoods in Lubbock's rural areas on the fringes of the town that would most benefit from microtransit. A key benefit in this particular case is that it ensures people living in more disconnected areas, especially seniors, won't become isolated from key services as the pandemic progresses because they benefit from this shuttle-based service. And it essentially highlights where an agency and the community as well will get the biggest bang for the taxpayer's buck. This is, of course, a preliminary planning tool. It's not designed to be totally used without concern by agencies, but we found it's an immensely valuable tool to kickstart solutions for transit agencies and start conversations, especially smaller ones that are usually under-resourced and don't have the bandwidth to carry out this kind of analysis themselves. So to sum up, I hope I've managed to convince you of these three things. That firstly, the flexible nature of microtransit means it'll help a wider transport network recover much faster by making those networks more efficient, more resilient, and more trustworthy for riders, and that's especially vulnerable groups. Secondly, the advanced algorithms underpin Spares and other on-demand technology companies' operations means that agencies can have more oversight over who their riders are and how they travel. And that's important not only now to slow the spread of the disease, but also going forward to ensure transit's accessible to those who need it most. And finally, to ensure that transit is built to last, its planning should really be as data-driven as possible. So we've provided this free tool and others, once agencies come on board as partners with us, that empowers them to make the right decision, especially when they're under pressure. So I guess I'll wrap up by saying that COVID has been and continues to be very, very challenging for transit and other industries worldwide. But if we're to take a silver lining away from it, it's that it will probably force us to reconsider how we want to move around our villages, our towns and our cities. And especially with other crises looming, including climate change, the role of transit in society, in my opinion, has never really been more important. Thank you very much, and do get in touch at that email address that I've put down there, and check out our website, including the free tool that I mentioned earlier. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jerome. I think that's a really interesting area, and particularly the issue of data and using data to plan transport routes and transit services. It's something that the University of Hertfordshire has done a lot of work on. I was going to use the phrase experimenting on its students, which might come across as slightly the wrong way of putting it, but what that's meant has been actually experimenting with smart ticketing on its bus company to see and using data to plan that better. So the kind of stuff that Jerome's talking about is potentially very interesting for the future. I can see questions starting to come in on that as well. What I'd now like to do, though, is to go on to Austin Blackburn from Go Coach, who's the main bus operator in West Kent. Austin hasn't, I think, done much of a presentations on things like this. What he's going to do is to describe what I think he was planning to do prior to lockdown and what that's led to during the lockdown in terms of demand responsive transport services and what the impact of that has been. I think it'll be interesting to see how that applies to other rural areas as well. So, Austin, thanks very much.
Hello there. Welcome to Go Coach in Sevenoaks. For those of you who don't know Sevenoaks or know where it is, we're in a terribly rural place. Even though we're very close to London, it's incredibly rural here with small roads. And, you know, I say to with our drivers, the only thing we have in common is they have the same license. It's very, very different here. So for the last couple of years, I've been looking at how we could do things differently and do it better in Sevenoaks. And I'm just going to whiz you through what we've been looking at and then look at, tell you a little bit more about what we're actually doing now. So what do we need to change? We need to change because, to be truthful, we're just not appealing to people. I often say that, you know, it's not attractive what we do at the moment, which some people don't agree with, but I think that's, we're incredibly poorly used. We carry 0.5% of the people to the railway station in Sevenoaks, which is ridiculous when it's the third busiest station in Kent. So we need to do something to make public transport more attractive, and that's what we've been working on the last couple of years. Now, Sevenoaks, very discerning place, yeah. It's full of people that have got nice houses, good jobs, and a big commuter town for London, and they expect a lot. And they're the sort of things that we were saying that they really sort of are looking for. You know, everything needs CCTV and security now. It's expected in anywhere, let alone around here. We should be environmentally friendly, and our vehicles are quite new, but they're not as new and not as green as maybe some of them should be. We still don't take contactless payment on our vehicles because we haven't got the right platform to do it here, unfortunately. Nor have we got real-time information that's reliable for our passengers either. So these are all the things that we've been looking at to try and improve in the future. So what we've come up with our partners, Kent County Council and Sevenoaks District Council, is the idea of using small microtransit or, you know, small vehicles to do what some of the buses do now. We've looked at what size vehicle we should be using, and the general feeling is that the sprinters that most people in the country are using actually are a bit too big, and we haven't had great experience with the sprinter product on the duty cycle that we put them through on normal fixed line stuff. So we're going for smaller vehicles, so Ford Transit, Torino size vehicles, but with a wheelchair ramp in the back. And the idea is, rather than just do one part of DRT, do a bit of everything. So we're going to do commuters in the morning, we're going to do special educational needs work at school time, we're going to do door-to-door DRT during the day, but also do work for Age UK on behalf of Sevenoaks District Council. We want them to be better and nicer and more attractive than buses. So they're in leather seats, air conditioning, USB charging points, things that aren't naturally on a bus. Safety and security, obviously big thing where we are. So we've gone for as safe and as secure as we can go for. Very few, if any, of the taxis in our area have CCTV, but obviously all the buses have, so we definitely want to have that. We want to make sure that we've got all the other good things that now small modern vehicles can have. Fully accessible. It was we had to have fully accessible vehicles because every bus we've got is covered by PSVAR. We can't even think about replacing buses with something that wasn't fully accessible. We wanted forward facing because we've done some research on that, and we found that actually, you know, taking a wheelchair in the side and putting them to the side is like, it's not really including them so much. Plus, obviously, Age UK, special educational need transport, we must have wheelchair spaces. We wanted to go as green as we could, but at the moment there isn't a plausible electric or hybrid vehicle out there. Ford are heavily pushing their hybrid, but in reality you can't buy it yet. They're talking about 2021. The electric ones, the Nissan's a bit small, and Mercedes haven't really caught up with it yet. So we've gone for the Ford. It's a brand new engine for Ford, built in Dagenham. It's as clean and green as you're ever going to get at the moment, but obviously in the future we might be looking to go for something a bit more exciting and environmentally friendly. So moving on to what we were going to do, the commuters are a big thing for us and a bit and something that we really want to do something more for. Like I said, yeah, we're carrying very, very few of them. So we looked to do an area that was quite close to the station. At the moment, the buses run at best hourly, and we're looking to do something at least every 15 minutes, and maybe with a pickup time or ETA of less than that. So there was the outline that we gave to the council and to the and to other people. The idea was fixed prices, pick them up corner to corner, not door to door, because you don't want to be picking up loads of different places and then delaying those people that are already on the vehicle going to the station, because all they're going to do is miss their train or might miss their train. And we also want to do something for the town as well. The town has got a very high professional level of businesses as solicitors, wealth management and stuff like that. Now we feel that they could probably be customers that we could potentially attract in the future. And then outside of those times, we were going to do a door-to-door shared ride service, which would take in like the greater Sevenoaks area and replace some of the buses in those areas, because the buses have to stick to bigger roads and they're very, very poorly used. There's the details of that one. The idea with that was we were going to try and do it a bit different, so more like taxi than bus, in that the fares would be variable on demand. We are not looking to accept concessionary fares unless we really are forced to, and make it more of a cheaper shared taxi experience than bus. So, and then obviously what we're stuck with now came along. And I was approached by VIA, our partners with all this, who have been very, very good. They said, oh, could we maybe use the technology to maybe deliver things or do things in a different way? And between us, we realised that what we actually could do was replace the existing buses by demand response. We typically were carrying about 10% of our normal passengers, which apparently is normal for certainly this country at the moment. So we developed this area. And we also put in the hospitals in the local area as well, because we felt that key workers might need to travel, that they can't to the hospitals that they can't normally do by one bus in a normal way. So in just 2 weeks, say with a team of 3 here and VIA at a time when it was Easter and it was Passover and all the other problems that you have at that time, we managed to develop this scheme. At the moment, we're operating 4 DRT buses between 6 and 6. All the fixed line bus routes in the area operated by Go, and we are the network operator, have been withdrawn. we're only at the moment serving roads where buses used to go, so people have to walk out to bus stops pretty well. We've also got the hospitals that we're linking with, and people can book on the Via Van app, or they can phone in, because obviously we carry quite a lot of older people, and unfortunately they're not really into the technology of using smartphones. So what were the challenges in doing it? There's a lot of challenges in doing it, to be honest. The biggest thing was that you need to change the way that people are going to use transport. You know, I tell my staff here, we've told people for 100 years to go to a bus stop and queue up and wait for a bus. Now, in 2 weeks, at a time when you can't communicate easily, you're telling them to forget that and go on an app or phone in. But it's, you know, we've got notices on every bus stop. We've done everything we can, engage all the stakeholders in the area, and we seem to have got the message out there. Via done a fantastic job at developing the app in time. There were some glitches, but to be honest, the public don't seem to have really seen it. We're also very lucky to secure funding from Kent County Council, who are very interested in this project and obviously see a bigger picture with it. The biggest single problem that we had as an operator was opening a Braintree account in the time frame that we had, but we managed to get around that in the end with everyone working together. We needed a website. We need to train our staff, and we need to map where we're going to go and everything. But all in all, we managed to do it. So the results. This is a little bit old, this one that I put on this slide I put on here. But in the 2 weeks that we've been operating, we've carried 723 passenger journeys, and it seems to be working really, really well. We've met 99% of the demand that we need of anyone that's asked for a journey, so we've really letting no one down. And our vehicle utilisation is better than it was. We were carrying about 1 person per vehicle per hour before we put this in. Now we're on about between 1.4 and 1.9, depending on the day. So it's really quite impressive stuff. There's just a little bubble map of where our passengers are travelling from. I mean, one of the things about this modern technology is the reports are amazing. The information that you can see is astounding compared to what we had with running fixed line buses. And you know, just looking at that graph there, you can clearly see where, if we went back to fixed line, the buses need to go, which is very, very important to us. Our pickup, I would say, normally our buses run at best hourly, and now we've got an average pickup time of 11.6 minutes. I had a quick look, and people are having to walk no more than 81 meters, and our average ride rating is 5 out of 5, which is astounding. So, you know, and we've had no unhappy people at all. And that's about it from me and Go Coach. But I'd like to thank you very much for looking at what we're doing. And if you have got any questions, please set them later or somehow get hold of me and ask me. I'm more than happy to help anyone.
Thanks very much, Austin. I think people agree that's an interesting presentation. And an interesting way of rethinking buses in a rural area, both the original concept and what's happened with the lockdown. Finally, by the way, please keep posting questions if you want to put them up, and I can put them to one or more of the panelists after all the presentations are finished. Can I now ask Richard Dilks, who's the Director of COMA UK, Combined Mobility UK, to give it its full title, and who will do a summary of what he's seen has been going on in this area and some thoughts for the future. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm hoping you can see my screen. So we are COMA UK, Collaborative Mobility UK, actually, although combination is very, very important, and not to worry at all. And I'll be dwelling on that combination point as I go through. So just a little bit about who we are and what it is that we're covering in terms of shared transport, shared mobility. Our key areas of activity lie in 3 areas. There's research, where we do by far and away the most comprehensive research into car club and bike share that's publicly available. There's accreditation, so we have a self-regulatory role there, absent legislation that defines what a good sharing scheme is or isn't. And then there's advocacy, events, link building, case making, very specific work that we undertake. We are a charity for the public benefit of this. So although we have a collective and representative role, it's that public benefit bit that we always keep first and foremost in our minds. So why bother about shared transport at all? COVID or not COVID, or inside or outside a city. So here are, for me, the key reasons. I think some of them are perhaps be very obvious, some perhaps a little less obvious. The interrelationships are the bit I want to dwell on here. They are very heavy between shared transport and public transport. Something that I think is still not as understood as it might be in policymaking circles, but our research again and again finds a very, very clear link between users using shared schemes and using public transport, and also a very clear link between shared transport and active transport. So for example, our bike share survey, we're consistently finding very high percentages in the last one, 50% of people have their own bike as well as using shared scheme bikes. So the world doesn't neatly divide, of course, into people using only one type of thing or another. People use what they know about and what will suit their needs. Shared is a great provider of options for some journeys that cars are sledgehammer nut for, and have lots and lots of other downsides for us all, of course, and often where public transport struggles to provide. And actually Austin's presentation was a brilliant case study of that, where shared can help fill these gaps. So shared and public in terms of transport planning really should be seen as close cousins, at the least, I think, and ideally in the future thought of in those terms. We think about master planning in terms of land use, or strategic planning in terms of transport planning. Really important to have those two, and active travel to make the 3 in mind as you go through understanding how people could and should, I would argue, move around in an area in the future. Challenges are quite manifold, so we can take this slide as being sort of frozen pre-COVID-19, say the date is March the 5th or something like that. And although we were at an all-time high in terms of provision of schemes and users across the country on shared transport, there are significant headwinds. So although Britain got going early on this stuff, Como itself is over 20 years old, we are quite a long way from where the leading countries in this space are, typically in Northern Europe, so certainly Germany, Belgium, Netherlands significantly ahead of us in terms of percentage of population using schemes and giving up private cars and so on. And a lot of it again comes down to coordination. And I think some of it also comes to leadership and bravery, being willing to take a step. And undoubtedly one of the potential upsides of this mobility revolution that we've all been pitched into with COVID-19 is that actually lots and lots of us, whether decision makers or recipients of something, have taken big steps very, very quickly. So I'll turn to what we might be able to build on there. So the sector's obviously found its user base disappear away to pretty much nothing, like most forms of transport. Varies slightly from area to operator and so on, but sort of 90% down is a typical figure. What they quickly started doing though, and I'm very encouraged by this and have been encouraging them, and you'll see that link on our website there. I will try something slightly fancy. I don't know if that works to just give a sense of scale here. So this is the page on our site, which we keep updated whenever we get new details in from all the different things across bike share, lift sharing to work, typically car share of all forms. So these are all offers for key workers on essential journeys, typically 50% reduction. And that's seen some quite strong usage, and I think that's a no-brainer at this time, where these fleets would be inactive the vast majority of the time anyway. And of course, it's facilitating journeys that we all want these workers to be undertaking. Hopefully, it also gets policymakers thinking about the future potential here, and I've been in some ongoing talks with the Department for Transport about that and the Scottish Government, where it may awaken them to different ways of doing things in the future, which would undoubtedly be a positive pivot. But there are some big headwinds here. So to add to my previous load, I think we've got some new ones that have been touched on already largely. Propensity to share, which will undoubtedly affect, I think, public transport and shared transport. What is the right standard to hold a transport system to in terms of cleanliness, masks, etc., etc. This is unclear nationally at this time of speaking. We've also got to add the very existence of operators. This is a sector that's is very largely subsidy free. So it's a point I've not failed to make to governments and will carry on making, that the last thing we want to do is come out from this public health crisis in stages, hopefully back to the climate crisis that Jerome touched on earlier, only to find that in terms of shared transport's ability to deliver, we've got radically reduced fleet sizes, operators that have disappeared, etc. So some thoughts on in this new world we're in, how shared could play a role, never on its own, alongside public and active, as I said earlier, outside cities. And we'll start with the how. So shared schemes take a while to get going. We found that again and again and again through our 2 decades. So it's really important to focus on where we've got stuff already. So that can be schemes, by which you mean a car club scheme or a bike share scheme, some sort of formalized arrangement. We need to really get the most out of those. We need to think, how could they be expanded? How could they be better utilized in particular? How can public and private sector work together to do that? What might be the future role of subsidy? Will there be an increased subsidy need here? Is there a recognition that, like public transport, some areas, routes will attract subsidy, others don't need to, they're commercially viable, but in the blend between the two, you can get more than the sum of the parts. But also to look at existing assets. So as several of the presentations already have touched on, I think this is a time to look at what we've already got on the ground and what that can be assembled into. The peer-to-peer car sharing platforms are particularly interesting here. They've been doing a lot with the key worker journey facilitation. We have, I would certainly argue, rather too many private cars in this country. So it'd be rather good to make better use of the ones we've already got for journeys where cars are needed. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. Actually, there's an obvious coordination problem and policy setting problem. There's a lot of interest from authorities as to where they should position themselves around this. But just in a broad point, I think there's a lot of potential there. Then enhancing those, so it's not going to be enough if we just look at what we've already got, particularly in terms of schemes, because a large part of the country, particularly outside conurbations, are not covered by shared transport of a formal kind at the moment. So I think their clusters are the way to go, and by clusters I mean a mix of clusters and people and journeys. Sorry, clusters of people and journeys. There are some obvious ones that I've popped on there. Other ones will spring to mind. But these to me really are the low-hanging fruit, relatively speaking. And we're finding in some work we're doing in Scotland at the moment around business parks, that the ability of people to lift share to work and then also to use public transport is very high, far higher than their actual take-up of those things. That doesn't automatically translate, of course, over into take-up, but nonetheless, I think there's some number of interesting examples. We had one at our conference last autumn, an Arup site in the West Midlands, which was done through Lift Share, the social enterprise Lift Share, with a range of other measures alongside lift sharing. They managed to go from minimal lift sharing, they did have an existing scheme, to nearly 50% in between 3 and 4 months, without, of course, COVID-19. So some big changes are ripe are potential in some places. I think some places are ripe to fall. Interestingly, there they did use the stick of taking away the ability to park 5 days a week in the car park. That went down to 2. Unless you lift shared. They brought in an enforced checking system with the lift sharing so that it couldn't be gamed. But they did a whole host of other things too. So they invested in cycle facilities, in a shuttle bus to the station to boost public transport use, and then also offered to cover people's emergency journeys, these sort of my child is sick at school type journey, by taxi or whatever suitable means at the company's expense. Just a microcosm of some of the things can be achieved, I think. So that's clusters. Then corridors. I think Beate's brilliant efforts with the e-cargo bike show this, that again it's a point about concentration. So I think quite a lot of where it goes wrong outside cities is that people look broadly across it and think this is a rural area, that means it's not very densely populated, that means there are lots of origin destination pairs that are scattered around the place. That may be the case, in which case it's probably going to be very hard, and nationally speaking those aren't the places we should really focus first. But that's not the case across an awful lot of rural Britain, actually, and a lot of rural journeys, rural to rural, but also rural to peri-urban or urban to market town and so on. And it's understanding those and going after those, I think, should be the priority. Austin's work again in Seven Oaks demonstrates that very nicely, I think. So I think there's some sort of need for an assessment tool, set of tools and expertise base to be developed here by by the relevant authorities. And then a bit longer term, I think there's a real role for building things differently, moving the goalposts, literally in that sense. This is a concept that we've been developing the UK aspects of and refining for the last few months. The link there, again, I shall try a bit of, by my standards, IT wizardry and just give you a little flavour here, is to something that's on our website, for which I encourage you to have a look here. It's 15-20 pages of introductory content on mobility hubs. So this is where shared transport, public transport and active all come together. I've put in some examples from our Northern European partners. We work with an EU programme on this. And what we're hoping to do through this year is to build some detailed toolkits and guidance and advice that go beyond what's in this introductory document, and also to work with individual entities that are trying to bring forwards mobility hubs. Done right, I think they can suit a lot of different places. Here is an example from Hamburg at the top and Flanders at the bottom right. I think one thing Britain might be able to do really well is design them very nicely. We actually have a lot of public realm expertise in this country. It can be brought to bear. You can do this in outside city locations without doubt. And I've put some examples up here on the screen. In many ways, they suit themselves to being outside certainly dense parts of cities, because then they can be rather larger. And you can also play around with what these things are. So I'm talking about mobility hubs, which naturally lends everybody to think we're talking about transport. But of course, I mean, these could have a very heavy community focus. This could be where a lot of those services that suddenly we found in COVID-19 are better to have rather more local, the pharmacy, the doctor's appointments that we can access and so on, that these could be. There could also be a heavy freight element to these. For first last mile pickup and distribution. If we are going to have a lot more people working from home, I think these could very well form part of the fabric. Those elements they bring together can then be married up with transport. So you could have ones that are quite a blend of destination and interchange, or those that are much more about interchange and onward movement, or those that are much more about destination. Think of a science park, for example, where you have several thousand people there during the day. The appetite there to have somewhere for the yoga class, to have somewhere communal, to have somewhere to be able to gravitate towards. I think then, just building on the freight point there, there is a real role for fleets here too, and I'd have them in the clusters list, so that operators, whether they are local authorities, other public services, how do they best use their fleets? How do they get the most out of them? How do they then spread that fleet approach across into their staff, perhaps staff or residents using them for private journeys? It's been done in microcosm in lots of places. A number of councils up and down the country have done this, and then opened up the cars, vans and so on to residents at weekends. But I think we could potentially go further and faster on that in COVID with the behaviour change we've seen. That's me. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Richard. I've got some questions come through, and I'll ask some of those in a moment. Some of them, as you know, there's a general one, which is it's been asked of. It's been asked of Beate, but I wonder if it's actually a broader point, which is Simon Reed said there's a novelty effect here. This has gained a lot of traction, as you as a result of the unique nature of the proposal. But is this a solution to the future, or is this an opportunistic novelty? And I wonder whether that was true not just of Beate's proposal, but of microtransit, DRT, etc. We've had another question in about that, which I'll perhaps come back to. So that the first one is is this just a passing novelty for COVID, or is this something that's going to happen generally? Then there's sort of alternatives. Beate has been asked by Robert Chopin. I can see, well, why not just an EV van? Wouldn't you get the same benefits from that as opposed to a cargo bike? A question about different vehicles in Austin's thing. I mean, does the Via Van app work better than a more manual system, and that kind of thing? So I think there's some sort of questions there which are specific to some of the to some of the presentations, but a more general one, which is this just a flash in the pan? And then we'll go back to ordinary fixed public transport, ordinary car use, why is this likely to stay with us? Well, that's quite an interesting set of questions. Beate, do you want to pick up the first one? First one, novelty, and why not just an EV van?
Okay, so I'll do the EV van first. EV van, very expensive. Can't afford an EV van. I was very lucky to have an electric cargo bike hire, which was affordable within my means. And the other issue about vehicles is that you need a driving license. Some of my riders don't actually have a driving license, so you've got, they're experienced cyclists, but they're not having a driving license. You don't have to have the specific insurance for if you use your car for deliveries, then it's effectively higher in reward, so you would be contravening your insurance policy. So there's all sorts of issues around just using an EV van, cost, licensing and insurance. Is it a novelty? I think the novelty is actually about the environment that we're in. I know that a number of local authorities have put in for bids for electric cargo bikes in West Yorkshire and also in Manchester, and we're just on the border between those two proposals. So there's a lot of interest in electric cargo bikes in the UK as a whole, and I don't think that they are a novelty as a form of transport in any way. I think the novelty is having a desperate need for delivery and for local last mile delivery in a rural area. It's not something that's happened before. We've had very reticent businesses not wanting to go online, not even wanting to take credit cards, and suddenly they've had to up their game, take credit cards, go online, deal with people communicating them in, you know, by electronically, by phone, by email, and via websites. So that's the novelty, is the going online business and the delivery, the need for delivery. Is a cargo bike any better or worse solution than a van? It's a better solution in terms of the emissions, clearly. It's a better solution in terms of blocking roads. We have, whilst we have hills, which are sort of predicate against having e-cargo bikes, we also have lots of ginnels and alleys and lanes and cobbled run-throughs and quite poor surfaces, and actually the cargo bike deals with those much more competently and much more appropriately than a DPD van, which will barely squeeze down some of the tracks and that are parts of our environment and landscape. In terms of how sustainable it is over the long term, I think this is something where, you know, I just thought there is an opportunity here that the world is changing in this very moment, and we need to try and seize it. So so I went very much on a gut instinct with this. In terms of the future, I think things will continue to change, and that will mean that people are dispensing with cars probably because they're finding them too expensive. And in those sorts of instances, I think that showing people that there is an alternative to having to use a car, to having to own a car, to having to drive yourself somewhere, everywhere, all the time, is really, really important. And as I go around, I don't do all of the deliveries, but when I try and do at least one round a week, I talk to people about their what they think of it, and people are very, very positive and very interested and very ambivalent about their own car ownership. I think this is part of the thing, that part of what COVID has enabled us to do is to reassess some of our choices and some of our life patterns. So I don't think it's a novelty is what I want to say. And I think that, you know, not everyone's going to change overnight. That is never a situation. But I think that it will enable some people to change, and that creates momentum, which will enable more people to change and for it to become a more long-standing part of our transport mix.
Thanks. Jerome, do you want to pick this up? In particular, Robert Schleppen has also asked you, can your planning tool be used once services are back to normal to assess areas which lack transport links and could benefit from micromobility even in normal times?
Yeah, so I echo what Beate said. For microtransit, we've obviously got plenty of evidence that people were investing in microtransit before COVID happened. And that's not to say microtransit is the panacea, the solution for everything all the time. Clearly there's space for high frequency buses that need to transport lots of people. Obviously subways or tubes or whatever you want are also a very key part of that solution. But in areas that have been transit deserts in the past, we're finding a little bit like Austin has in Sevenoaks, that this kind of flexibility and usability of the service is something that is basically, I think, the future. What it also does is that microtransit is an operational model. It's not just a technology. The technology that we are aiming towards is the EV-AV enablement, right? So if you have an operational model that allows cities to procure vehicles on a mass scale, then it really enables the transition towards electrification and potentially automation in the future. With regards to the planning tool, that's a great question. Yes, it's built into the way that it works, is that once you kind of go back to zero, we essentially have a sort of positive side of the matrix, where we recommend based on how people use the buses. So we start drawing in data on actual transit usage on a city by city basis, which is all often open source anyway, to recommend how you might flip the different interventions depending on what kind of frequency your bus lines are. And as I said, this is a kind of starting point, but it's a transit planning tool that we're integrating slowly into our wider models. So we're finding it's got a lot of traction, and I think is the way that microtransit companies are probably going to be moving in the next few years anyway. Is not just providing, you know, the operational side of things, but also the big picture thinking and the planning side, because as we run these services, I'm sure Austin knows, the data that you collect on human behavior is really quite amazing, and it allows you, as Austin mentioned, to pinpoint when you do start up a new bus line, why put it where the 32B was before, where you only had 1 passenger an hour? Why not put it where you know there is demand? And I think that's the powerful thing about this technology.
That's great. Austin, do you want to pick up those points? And also a question about somebody saying, or two ones really that I've noticed. One's from Keith Dubbs saying, were you intended to use the Via Van app anyway for your new service? I think the answer is, and the Via Van versus a more manual system. And a question about Sittingbourne, because Arriva had a DRT system in Sittingbourne, which they pulled out of. Has COVID made DRT more viable or less viable? So thoughts about that, and about what you do where you haven't got broadband, as in the Peak District National Park, as somebody has asked. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on those.
First one, we were going to do DRT or do something like DRT way before. We were looking at this, say, certainly a year ago, on what sort of technology we were going to use to actually control the vehicles. Initially, we did think that maybe we'd just do it manually and not do it through a app. But then by doing some research and, I say, working with Kent County Council, we realised, I mean, Via is the premium product as far as we can see, and we were lucky enough to have that supported by Kent. So we've gone with them. So yeah, we were definitely going to do something DRT anyway. It's just now we're doing it with big buses and not little transits, really. What was the second question? Oh, I've lost you, sorry.
It was Arriva having tried DRT in another bit of Kent and moving out. And does that make DRT more likely to work or less likely to work during this period?
Well, during this period is a little bit different. We're in a very different financial world at the moment, and obviously we're funded in different ways. So at the moment, because we're essentially getting many of the subsidies that we're due to get if we're operating, yet we're not operating anything like we would normally be, even though we're massively down on revenue, it's sustainable. And I was looking at that only this morning. As far as Arriva Click's concerned, essentially it was an experiment. The whole thing is, you can't make a sprinter work, financially work, without it doing other stuff. I can't quite grasp how people don't get the message with this. It isn't big enough. You can't carry enough people in a sprinter to make it commercial. It needs to do something else. And that's why we looked at the Age UK thing, and that's why we looked at commuters and bits and pieces like that. You've got to put stuff together, SEN. You can't just do commercial work with sprinter-sized vehicles. Stagecoach done little and often in Ashford, and again, it financially didn't work. It doesn't add up. You can't carry enough people.
That's interesting. Just for Richard, then, a couple. I mean, the novelty question you might want to pick up on, but I've also got a couple that seem to be for you. One is your role on what role bicycles and e-scooters will play in the recovery plan for communities, ownership versus shared micromobility transport solutions, and also microtransit for a new rural economy jobs, sort of rural public back Uber, Kenny Uld says. Mix of functional journeys and tourism. So you talked about tourism. Is anybody actually using microtransit to meet both visitor and resident demand?
Okay, thank you. So the novelty point, I mean, you'd be crazy to think that there is not going to be a huge rush back to former behaviours when that's allowed or vaguely allowed. Of course there will be. I think equally though, this has already gone on long enough that there's some behaviour change that's organically embedded, at least for a while, and it's that I think is critical, that we all try to seize on and mould. But I guess we've got to mould it in a way that you know, that actually works for people. I was struck with something Austin said early on in his presentation about you know, we just weren't, slightly, not quite your words, Austin, slightly paraphrasing, but we're not doing enough of what people want. You know, they're not carrying enough people. And that's something that's, you know, it's a lesson that has rather passed quite a lot of public transport by for too many decades, really, and it's been left to private car designers and sellers and so on to very adeptly try and make the most of that. And I think we need to have that in mind all the time and play this constant chicken and egg game of pushing people's behaviour in some ways, but in ways that work for them. That's the balance to strike. Can e-scooters, bikes, and I would add e-bikes to that list, be part of that? I'd very much like to think so. I think they absolutely should be. The department is out for consultation on micromobility at the moment. Probably most people listening know. Deadline is the 22nd of next month. We'll certainly be responding to that. We're doing a roundtable with them next week about it. One on flexible bus DRT also. And I suspect the deadline will get extended back, so we'll have a little bit more time. But I think in the right places, e-scooters can play a valuable role. If there's controversy about where those right places are, then let's have a good debate about defining what they are. But let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater with saying, well, they may not work in all places, so we shouldn't have them. The key bit is to think intelligently across areas about how we knit these things together. And microtransit, rural tourist sort of examples and so on. We have, like, I mean, so much in shared, and until actually the very last few years, where I'd say shared has started to gain some really significant market share scale in some parts of the country, but some parts only. I think the history here with the tourist and journeys is lots of great bottom-up initiatives, a car here, a car there, a relationship with the National Trust here or with a national park there, and so on. But hard to scale, hard to sustain. So like a lot of community car club efforts, for example, great that they're there, but difficult to keep them going and to scale them and grow them. But that doesn't mean the idea wasn't right. And I think there's just a need to do those things bigger and better where there's been a decent assessment of where the demand is. You know, what we all need to do is what Austin's just been through of, you know, at last, here's where the demand is and here's where it isn't, and therefore you're much more able to think about tailoring to that. So it becomes a data point quite largely.
Thanks very much.
Can I just pick up on that very briefly? What Richard alluded to in his presentation, which is essentially that line from the Field of Dreams film, if you build it, they will come, was, I think, far too long the attitude of transit agencies and infrastructure providers. And now we're essentially flipping it on its head, which is, you know, saying build it where they come or where they want to go. And I think that's a really powerful, it seems like a simple thing, but that's a really powerful thing to bear in mind when you're running either a technology company or an operator or a think tank. And I think that's something worth bearing in mind for everybody on the call as well.
That's great. Well, look, we're at time. I'm just going to ask the panelists to say a few words in summary, and then I'll just sum up and then we'll finish. Beate, do you want to have any final comments? You're muted, I think.
There we go. I think really the only thing that I have to say is that this is it's a live experiment in transport, and it's an amazing opportunity that we have at the moment to try things out. I mean, I think what Austin's doing is brilliant as well. And this, you know, I think if anyone gets offered a chance to try something, then they really need to do that trying out at the moment. And Cargodale is trying out, and I'm absolutely delighted about how much demand there's been for it, how much use it's got, how many patterns we can establish, and how much data we're collecting. But so that's the other thing, is collect all the data, keep it, and then hopefully as we reach a new normal, we'll be able to use that data to build things that have much more longevity.
Thanks. Jerome, do you have any final thoughts and comments?
Yeah, I'd echo that. The big word is opportunity. I think there's a real task at hand right now to deal with what we're currently facing. and people like Austin, who are on the front line of doing this and implementing these things, are doing a wonderful job. The long-term solution does rest, as Beate said, on data, but data that's used responsibly and with empathy, I think, as well. As I alluded to, security, privacy issues about certain technologies, and how you use data to empower people, and not necessarily everybody, but the people who need it most as well. So thinking about the equity piece around this is really important as well, I think.
Yes, and Austin. You know, do you think, somebody's asked, do you think your scheme will become the new norm?
I don't think what we're doing exactly at the moment will become the new norm. I think that elements of it will, though. I mean, picking up on Jerome said, we, right from the day one, have had some of the passengers use the app to travel across our network on a journey they wouldn't be able to do normally on one bus. So does that mean the buses aren't running to the right places? You know, we need to question that right from day one. I thought they might do after a little while, but you know, for some people, and especially some of the ones that are in social housing and the like, to be doing that obviously clearly shows that maybe we need to be thinking again on how we do stuff. And I think that we need to, you know, we're going to look at maybe like 3 schemes really. So we're in scheme 1 at the moment. There'll be a transitional scheme 2, and then what it all ends up with in scheme 3. But this can change the face of how people travel in Kent, maybe even in the country forever.
Thanks. And Richard, any final thoughts?
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me on here. This has been fascinating. We need to keep the spirit and the actions of these things going. So my key point is really united we stand. You know, that there's so many efforts already underway, lots more potential, all heading in really the same direction. So I'm in sort of bridge building mode out to other organizations and people as to try to press the case with decision makers of all kinds as we hopefully emerge in waves from this. You know, there's lots that needs to be done. There's lots of harder stuff, political bravery, legislation, policy change, and so on. And there's actually lots of relatively easy stuff too. So it's can we stick together and make our points more congruently to powers that be, and also support those that are, you know, trying to get on with stuff on the ground, and in particular getting into you know, that untapped demand for sustainable transport that Austin was just touching on there. Let's not do hit and hope, which is an awful lot of what's been going on before, to Jerome's point. Let's be a bit more laser guided, and that'd be a huge upside from going through COVID-19.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all our speakers, and to the organisers, Jeremy Bennett in particular, who's done all the behind the scenes work, Carlotta da Vega Bastana, who's set this up from the Bauer end, and also to University of Hertfordshire colleagues, Scott Copsey, Sue Walsh, and others who've also helped with this. Just a few concluding thoughts from me. Firstly, thoughts about new opportunities, the use of data, and also what Austin's describing is what, and Jerome too in a way, is what used to be called total transport. The idea of bringing together different demands together and aggregating them. And there's a lot of work going on that at the moment. I think also concepts like mobility hubs also seem to be a coming thing. The University of Hertfordshire is going to continue to explore these through a set of roundtables and a report later this year on different aspects of opportunities for rural transport, but obviously now informed by the experience we've had with COVID and the very strange times that we've been living through. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this webinar and found it interesting. Deb Carson has commented at the end, is this then about building demand through these new approaches? And the answer is yes. I think that's exactly what this is about. I hope people will take things away from this and look at ways of doing this kind of thing elsewhere, not just during this lockdown period, but afterwards as well. We'll be posting a recording of this so people can replay it. And these slides will also be available. So thanks very much to everybody who's been on this, and hope people here on this stay safe and well. Thank you.